By the way, you clicked on Prototype, episode 12. And since I said by the way before I said 12 by the way, I don't need to say by the way after saying 12 by the way, by the way. Now that we've done that intro and it was very important, trust me, let's talk about single player content, or just content in general in RTS, right? I was playing around in my head, like, what do I name this episode? What do I call this episode? Well, you'll know the answer to that technically I'll know the answer to that before you do, because I'm uploading the episode, but you know what I mean. Like, I don't actually know the episode as I'm recording this right now. The important detail here that really is going to ground our conversation about single-player content, or just content in general that's, you would say, maybe a bit more on the casual side. We can think of co-op content for this as well, where you're primarily fighting against computerized opponents, right? AI, as we usually call them, before AI became a terrible buzzword. When we're talking about something like that, most people have a very different understanding of what that content really looks like. A lot of the times it has no resemblance to any sort of multiplayer metagame that has developed. It might not even have the same starting conditions. In fact, it almost always involves the opponents that you face in these kinds of missions or campaigns really just having a lot of map control at the beginning of the game, to the point where if they decided to attack you immediately with all of the things that they started the map with, you would stand no chance of victory. And that's even assuming they were really bad and just decided to not micro their units whatsoever, which in fact many AI actually fail to do often. Now, that being said, it doesn't mean that this is all this content can be. In fact, I've spent probably most of my time talking about RTS games from a standpoint of being critical for the express purpose of improving the medium and the genre. I've spent most of my time, I think, talking about content, because I started out just making custom campaigns in StarCraft Brood War, and I also dabbled a little bit in the other subsequent Blizzard RTS games, Warcraft 3 and StarCraft 2. However, unfortunately, they didn't actually have more functional AI than StarCraft 1. They had less, and that's not saying much considering how bad StarCraft 1's AI actually is relative to the perceived ceiling, the position I want things to be in, right? I'm envisioning AI that can do a lot of these more involved strategies, like being able to contain the player, or proxy the player, or do some sort of opening gambit, or make a read based on what the player is actually doing, what they're scouting, and etc. Unfortunately, we can't even start to talk about that properly in the context of RTS content without at least establishing what's going to be different about all of the content that I produce for RTS games and for mods like Cosmonarchy Brood War, our gigantic overhaul of StarCraft 1. One of the things that is really going to be different is the fact that, again, and maybe you can already read through the lines here, the AI is going to try to compete with you. Your opponents, and indeed your AI-controlled allies, will be competent enough at their jobs to warrant the inclusion in a narrative that is ostensibly about these military conflicts and campaigns. This is a situation that you almost never see in RTS campaigns, in fact, and I can't really remember the last time I had an AI-controlled ally anyway. Maybe some of the StarCraft 2 missions towards the tail end of that campaign, but oftentimes they didn't even expand. So where are they even, playing the RTS game? Does that ever happen? Well, the answer is not really, right? If you look at the anatomy of the average StarCraft 1 mission, for example, assuming you even have control of a base, because unfortunately there are a lot of micro missions in campaigns, you'll oftentimes be faced with an enemy, assuming you have an ally at all. It's very rare. In fact, I can't actually immediately think of any time you did have an AI ally in the StarCraft 1 campaigns. But you know what? My memory might be foggy, so we'll just say, talking about your opponents for the moment, they don't expand, right? They simply start off with a significant portion of the map under their control. Again, they could just attack move all of their units, grab them all and throw them at your base, and the mission would be over. There would be no chance of you winning. But because they don't do that, we immediately know that they're bad and dumb and not very good players. On top of that, we start to think of them as players, or as sort of dumb enemies that are just there to pretend and role play that we're actually playing the role of the commander, pretend that we're actually doing it instead of actually doing it. And that's really immersion breaking, because if you're trying to develop some sort of narrative where characters are competent and that's what makes them respectable, you can't really do that if they could have beaten me at any point, but they just chose not to for really, I was going to say some reason, but really no reason. And beyond having all of the map under their control, they oftentimes start with a very massive bank. Most of the AI in StarCraft 1 has about 10,000 minerals and gas at the map start. And that actually isn't that much in terms of like long games. You will spend a significant amount of money more than that, but it's a lot, obviously, compared to the maybe couple hundred that you might start out with as the player. And of course, they also have this crazy advantage in terms of pre-placed assets, all the units and structures that they have. They might have tier 3, the maximum tier of the game, unlocked immediately as that at the word go, or they might at the very least have a significant chunk into tier 2, like the very first Zerg mission starting the Terrans out with Wraiths, a starport, and a bunch of Goliaths. That is very different to you starting out with a couple of Zerglings and not even a spawning pool. So when we put all of this into perspective, some people will simply say, oh, well, it's an older game, right? And surely at 1998, maybe this actually was the best that the games industry could offer us, or at the very least, it's more understandable. The problem is that things didn't really get better in RTS content, you see. A significant portion of missions that would come later, like in the average StarCraft 2 campaign mission, would actually in many ways regress from this point, because at the very least in Brood War, the AI had to build new units, right? They often didn't have anything spawned in. So if you destroyed their production structures and they didn't rebuild them immediately, which they often didn't, then okay, well, you have an advantage, right? And so it's still bad. It's still resulting in you essentially having to kind of turtle in your base, and you can't do any sort of early game interaction. You can't really do any rushes or try to get any damage done, and unless it's very, very specific, almost like puzzle map solutions instead of playing a more conventional RTS game. So you're playing very differently than what you would actually want to play if you saw the game's descriptors, described to you on the back of the box or something. You go to the Steam page and you see, damn, this person's having a good time talking about how strategic the game is. I can't wait to, oh, never mind, I'm just going to turtle in my base and then mass up a maximum supply army and then attack. And that's usually the play pattern instilled in you, which is obviously very anti-competitive, because if you do that, then your opponent will maybe contain you, expand up, and just destroy you. And then you'll have nothing, and you'll think to yourself, well, I beat the campaigns, why can't I play? So in StarCraft 2, they actually do a little bit worse than that, because you don't even really have the opportunity to attack into enemy bases a lot of the times. My mind always goes back to this one mission in Heart of the Swarm where you had to defend Kerrigan's Chrysalis while they undid one of the things that they did to her in the climax of the previous campaign, because what are stakes and permanence, right? But that's about the narrative. We're not necessarily talking about that right now. And while you're doing this holdout mission, defending this chrysalis at the primordial spawning pool, or whatever it was called, you'll eventually see that a bunch of enemies, the primal Zerg, are spawning in from off the map. And this means that you actually don't have the opportunity to stop the enemies from sending you units. You can't target production structures. You can't target bases that are, giving them economy and allowing them to fund more units and thus create more of a threat towards you. You can't really mitigate the enemy's attacks at all, because if you did that, then Blizzard wouldn't have such fine control over exactly how long the mission could last without you being bored because there was nothing spawning in or nothing attacking you. It's almost like maybe holdout missions are kind of flawed to begin with, and you kind of always have to be able to eventually turn on your aggressors and take the fight to them or something, or at the very least you need to make it so that it's actually really challenging to get to the end of the cooldown, to the point where it's very unlikely you'd be able to wipe the whole map before the end of the timer. But I digress. Thinking about that mission just puts so much into perspective for me. It's one of the things that I always try to point to, because most people who even like StarCraft 2 didn't like Heart of the Swarm. They found the narrative especially really quite childish and stupid. Not to say that the other campaigns were much better in that respect, but Heart of the Swarm more so in many ways. And then on top of it all, it was the least, impressive campaign, I guess, if you want to use the term. I would really hate to use that term for any of the campaigns, but it just seems to me that from sampling the people who I do know and have known in the past, even if they liked Wings of Liberty or even Legacy of the Void, they weren't really big fans of Heart of the Swarm, this Zerg-centered campaign where you pretty much are dealing with these weird, wacky Kerrigan adventures, and she becomes infested again after you just de-infested her in the last campaign. So yeah, it's really, really quite silly, and maybe that's more so why they have misgivings and less so about the mission design. But when I point out this, because Heart of the Swarm is not really seen as the sacred cow, it's a little bit safer to criticize, and so people have it in their heads that it's okay to talk about how bad this campaign and product is. I don't know why they need to feel that way in general, of course, but okay, they're a little bit more receptive to me talking about how silly, this campaign is. I mean, it has like a Goku DBZ, what is it, Harry Potter wand fight with Kerrigan versus Narud. So that's pretty much all you need to know about it, honestly. Beyond all of that, right, we think about that one mission. We think about not being able to even see our opponent's bases. I mean, they don't really have bases. Obviously, there's just some triggers spawning them in, but you can, at the very least, in your mind, imagine that outside the map, there are Zerg bases building more units and thus sending them at us to attack. And when you're in that situation and you think to yourself, damn, like, what can I even really do? How can I engage with my opponent? Oh, I can't. And then you remind yourself, and this is true in all of the campaigns, but especially Legacy of the Void, that every time you step into a base, an enemy base, like, think of all of the StarCraft 2 missions. Now tell me how many of them, or roughly what percentage of them, you were actually supposed to destroy your enemy's base, which, by the way, is the victory condition of Melee, and it's the most commonplace way to ensure that your enemy has been defeated. Yeah, I can't actually remember any off the top of my head from Legacy of the Void at the very least. I know that, of course, there was that one mission on the Sky platform going into the Char section of Wings of Liberty where you could choose to either do a 4-hero micro mission or play the macro mission. And if you play the macro mission, while they're Zerg and they have, decent amounts of bases, I can't remember if they expand. I think maybe they do, which would be a real trend breaker, in fact. And obviously they have like a bunch of other weird stuff where they spawn in this super unit Leviathan, which is really cringe. But beyond the spawns and beyond the pre-placed assets, that's a little bit more like a Brood War style, just lazy, you start the AI with a bunch of advantages and hope that they occupy the player's time for long enough. That's that kind of approach, right? The older design that I still don't think is good, but is clearly better than having a bunch of bases that you can't access or are very heavily discouraged from accessing. In Legacy of the Void, you can start off the campaign, and when you're trying to do another holdout mission where you're surviving from Amon using Zerg and Protoss together on Ire, before you blast off using your newfound MacGuffin, you will note that you can actually start to engage with the enemy bases if you want by moving up their ramps. And when you do that, Karax, your advisor character, who looks like some weird fucking thing out of Overwatch, ends up saying stuff like, Praetor, you're getting really close to the, or I guess he's Hierarch. Hierarch, you're getting really close to the enemy's base. You shouldn't do that. And it's like, but this is an RTS though, bro. This is an RTS. This is what I'm supposed to do. That I'm supposed to kill the enemy's base. That they have to kill my base. So shouldn't I kill their base to naturally stop the flow of reinforcements? And when you start to think about this, it's like pulling on a thread and it just unravels before your eyes. This isn't an RTS product. You're not playing an RTS in these campaigns, especially the StarCraft 2 styled ones that are a lot more flavor of the map. What gimmick do we have today, Scotty? Where's the thing that I have to defend? How many of these things are going to be divisible by 3? Do I have to defend 3 things or destroy 3 things or what's the deal, dude? Like, what do I have to do that's completely different and antithetical to conventional RTS gameplay this time around when I boot up into the next map? And it's very clear that they're not actually even using these bases because they're just spawning them in. They're spawning in warp prisms, which then in turn spawn in warp in animation units. They're spawning in Nidus canals, which spawn in Zerg units. They don't have these. They don't have the warp gates somewhere that they can use to warp in the units. That's not really what they're all about. It's just, this is all the facsimile of an actual game being played and an actual enemy playing it. It might be more challenging in the sense that it might kill you a few times, but it's not more fair. It's not really an improvement. In fact, the ways that it regresses the formula are pretty significant and noticeable. You just look at it and realize I can't even attack the enemy base. I can't even manage the attacks that they're sending at me. So yeah, maybe it kills me a few times. Maybe it exposes that I might not be super mechanically good, or maybe I have a wrong strategy in mind for fighting a specific race or whatever, but it's never going to be doing so in an interesting way. I don't get to really have full control over my defeat because so much was stacked against me, and it's, at the end of the day, when I'm winning, it's still just kind of like me grinding through this block of pre-placed junk. Most of the time, the AI doesn't really defend their own bases when you attack in StarCraft 2. If there are some sort of defenses, it's usually because they, waypointed the spawns in a certain way and designed the map such that you kind of have to go through that waypoint in order to attack the bases. I think of a lot of the missions later on in Legacy of the Void for this too. I think of the mission where I can't remember what planet you're on, you might be on Ire or something like that, but you're dealing with all of these giant void obelisk things that spread void fields that damage your units while they're in them, and I think you have to destroy 5 of them. And you can set up like these forward posts for your allies, but they don't have any harvesting. They don't have any resources. Because obviously you'd think to yourself, well, if there's resources there, I can claim them and I can use them for my own advantage. Meanwhile, instead of that, there's just going to be these spawned in AI attack groups that are going to help manage the enemy's spawns. And then you get into this really weird behavior where you're not really doing anything though. Like you might as well be alone on the map because everything here is divorced of the consequences and the interactions and relationships that you normally get out of an RTS. The units don't cost anything for the AI. They don't have even the concept of resources. They don't really react to what you're doing. They just have some triggered events that decide what they decide to do and give them some sort of directive that is followed very, very strictly and not really interpreted based on personality or anything. And, to some degree, okay, you are fighting Amon a lot of the time, and that is going to mean that maybe a lot of the strategies are going to be similar. But you could certainly, have him use Zerg differently than he uses Terran, differently than he uses Protoss. That's one very obvious way you could do things. Or maybe he's controlled, Mobius Core and differently than he's controlled a different Terran group. And that group that he's controlled has some predilections. It has some things that they're good at. And of course, he's going to use them in the ways that they are good. And that would be one way to think about it, as well as all the different Zerg broods that he's taken over and maybe some of the different Protoss sects, since he has full control seemingly over the Kala. It would be not just like the Golden Fleet or whatever, like or Golden Armada, that's what it's called. There wouldn't just be that, right? It would be, maybe there'd be more, right? And so we're already asking questions about how it always feels so one note and boring. And the answer, realistically speaking, is because that's what it is. It's not really RTS content, because it's not really an RTS you're playing. You're certainly not playing against an opponent who's even remotely playing the same game as you, right? And I'm not saying that you have to design an AI that has limited APM and, some other weird shit that makes it like maybe get artificially more tired the longer the game goes on. I'm not asking developers to invest in trying to make AI players more human-like, which I actually know is something that happens in StarCraft 2, or at least did happen in the original Melee AI, where they were trying to simulate mouse clicks and all this other stuff that ended up, let's just say StarCraft 2 already isn't very performant, and that did not help things. On top of that, there's also the context that we need to shade in here about general ideas about level design, right? Like most of the time, because you're not playing a proper RTS game, maybe they don't need to expand too much. They don't need to give you too many expansions because, well, the AI doesn't use resources, and that goes for your allies and for your enemies. So even when you're in, something like Legacy of the Void, I'm pretty sure they made the decision to just flat out remove a lot of resources from most enemy or allied bases in the few missions you did have allied presence. Doing so because, well, what would you do if you're in that position as a player? You know that your AI doesn't use resources, so maybe you just blow up their command center and build your nexus there. That might have been able to work for, injecting yourself with a little bit more economic advantage. And then on top of that, even though it's very silly and you'd think counterintuitive, it results in you basically being in the situation where, because of bad decisions made previously in the stack of decisions that led us to this point, players can now get an advantage by doing something that should give them a decided disadvantage. Essentially crowbarring their ally's economy into the dustbin just so that they can get their own advantage. But their ally actually doesn't have a disadvantage because they're happily spending infinite amounts of money all the time anyway. They don't really care too much about supply for the same reason. I'm not even sure if they have an actual supply cap. I'm pretty sure actually that most of the waves just get spawned in and maybe they just have some weird way to disable the supply cap being required. In Warcraft 3, if you click on some of the Naga units, one of the things you might notice, because the UI does actually tell you, is that at least on the hard difficulty, the Naga Coral Reef, which is the supply structure for the half-finished race, gives 90 food for AI, but only, I think, 10 or 15 food by default for the player. And that's an obvious case where even the UI gets to tell you that, hey, by the way, these guys aren't even fucking serious about making their race, competitive. They don't care about, you having some sort of idea and how to approach, maybe crippling the AI's supply, because they can have one coral reef. And by the way, guys, 100 is the food cap by default. So if they have one coral reef, they are 9/10 the way there, 90% of the way there to having the ability to train almost as many units as you can even train in the whole game. Per player, of course. So that's really sad, obviously. That's quite sad. And that's not where it all ends, right? There's like the super warp gate unit, if you ever dig into the map files for StarCraft 2, that gives them the ability to warp in any unit at any location and not required by, to have power or anything. And it's just like, that's maybe good for a cutscene or something. I mean, I don't know why they wouldn't just create a custom trigger for it, but maybe that's like somehow more efficient in their data stack. Either way, they get to go through and say like, hey, here's a bunch of stuff that we can work on. Like, here's a bunch of, AI spawned in waves. Isn't that so engaging? And it's just clearly not the way to go. But everybody has gone that direction because I guess StarCraft 2 is financially successful. I'm not even 100% sure if that's true in the long arc, because it certainly didn't get reinvested in terms of development, right? Like, they've basically paused production now, where a bunch of pro players are like maybe occasionally doing some balance change suggestions and ideation. But other than that, they're not really doing much else. Like, they can't even be asked to add more microtransactions into the game, I don't think, which, by the way, is totally antithetical to what a developer should be doing anyway. But I would at least think to myself, oh, well, they at least care about continuing to make money. And apparently, maybe they've just decided it doesn't matter that much. So anyway, we get to this point in the episode of Prototype, episode 12, by the way. And this is the point where I have to say, if you think that I'm right about some of the things that I'm saying so far, there's probably a good opportunity for you to stick around, hit that sub button, because I talk about stuff like this all the time in these episodes. I talk about this stuff on my streams where I'm live streaming the development of Cosmonarchy Brood War and our RTS projects here at the No Frauds Club, talking about ways to completely shape the future of the genre and show people what they're missing out on, because I don't really think of this stuff as that revolutionary at the end of the day. But when I talk about this stuff, when I raise these points for people, they act like I've grown a second head or something. They can't believe that somebody could conceive of ways to do better than Blizzard, or ways to maybe just do better in general and show a very different style where they have all of these pre-programmed, almost like NPC type reactions when you talk about AI should be competitive even in an RTS. You talk about, like, in my RTS games, I intend for the tutorial to be able to kill you. I intend for the AI opponent in the tutorial to be able to defeat you if you're lazy and you don't really play that well, or if you're very slow to learn. And that doesn't mean I'm going to be overly punishing. In fact, the tutorial AI is going to be very easily held at bay. But like, an obvious way to do that is just make them really aggressive, but make the map design stationed such that you can easily choke out your opponent's forces and get way more cost-efficient trades. That's like a very simple way, where if they're just always rushing you, not really padding their economy or teching up, because they, maybe in their mind, you can start to think about all these character nuances. What does that say about them as a commander? Maybe they're really upset at being forced to, teach these newcomers or be a sparring partner for somebody so new or something. And maybe they just want to get this over with, and you're like the 5th cadet that they've trained today. So they're just like, fuck it, I'm just going to rush this guy. And, that's sort of how they would think about that maybe. And just keep on going, keeping upping the pressure. And as long as you can continuously, sort of stalemate them off, you can eventually build up your own tech, and you can eventually, rise up and understand the mechanics. And yeah, maybe you do lose the tutorial once or twice, but unlike in most games where that's not even conceivable, this will actually make sense. And when you play it a second time, you'll see, oh, wait, that maybe that's where I went wrong, and this is what I can improve. And you'll very quickly see that you have this cycle of being able to identify your own flaws in your own play and then improve them. And when was the last time you felt like you did that and it was actually satisfying within the context of an RTS campaign? Maybe you got better at one of the gimmicks in a map and had to redo it until you got good enough to finish it completely and do the right way as the developer approved solution. And you found that and you executed on it. But then, that kind of goes away, right? It's not like you can carry that lesson over. But the next time you see a choke point, you'll be reminded, oh, in the tutorial, I was able to kill like hundreds of units with only a couple, 20 20 units or something stationed on these ramps on either side, and maybe I can use that in the same way. Like, you'll have this subconscious, you won't have to articulate it. We won't have dialogue saying, hey, this ramp sure looks defendable, guys. Like, we don't need to, essentially, what would you call it? We don't need to just condescend to the player in that sense, that we can simply say, like, here's your base, and you look around and you decide for yourself what you want to do with the terrain. And you think to yourself, oh, well, they did say that this guy was kind of aggressive. Like, maybe the dialogue hinted at him being a little bit of a loose cannon, or maybe he got really angry. So, like, there's these subtle things, or maybe not so subtle, but things that you can use to decide yourself, like, what should I anticipate? And then, based on how the map plays out, you get to see, was I right? Did he try to immediately defeat me? Was I able to do that, use that lesson in future content? And well, the answer is going to have to be yes. Like, you can carry lessons through in past missions to future ones. And I mean, this is the kind of thing that it feels like nobody's doing in the RTS genre. And we've been at it for over 20 years, guys. Like, it's been a long time since Brood War came out. And while I think that's the best RTS, I can certainly see so many flaws in it, especially with the content. And I'm really, really quite surprised. And I'll say, to be honest, I'm quite disappointed that nobody's really done anything better than that. At least not without a lot of other misgivings or issues or things that I didn't like about the product. And with the content in particular, it just feels like everybody's gone the Blizzard route. Well, over here at the No Frauds Club and my personal YouTube channel, we don't really think too highly of Blizzard. I'm going to be honest. We're not really pumped about Stormgate. We don't think it's going to, open up a new echelon of RTS games to the public. We're not super stoked about everything that's been coming out from all the other RTS games of middling and higher budgets that have come to the limelight in the forefront and, made a splash in people's minds. No, we don't really see anything that we can get excited. And that's a shame, because we love RTS games. We love them so much that we're sitting here trying so hard as just essentially a two-man team in terms of developers, and then a bunch of people who are helping out behind the scenes to varying degrees, and then the community that we've fostered here. We are trying to push the genre ahead, and it doesn't feel like too many other people are getting out and pushing with us. You know what I mean? So if you like what I've said so far, I would greatly appreciate it if you hopped in the Discord server and talked a little bit about what your experience with the RTS is, because I feel like this kind of content, right? The kind of content I'm talking about, where you actually do have a lot to say, you actually do have a lot to learn, and, you can make improvements, you can learn nuances, and it's not just a bunch of gimmicks, and there's just rules that you can follow and that your opponents also follow, and they don't cheat, or at the very least, to the degree that they cheat, it's just intrinsic to how AI work, where they don't get tired and they can multitask really well. So at the very least, it doesn't feel cheap. It doesn't feel like, oh, if this game didn't have AI that was so, like just had a bunch of resources or had a bunch of starting assets, then maybe I would have won. Well, no, if fairness is core in the content's design, but it's actually challenging, wouldn't everybody want that? Wouldn't everybody like to play an RTS in their RTS campaigns? So yeah, that's my little appeal to the masses, I guess. And I'll talk a little bit more actually about what I want to do differently, because it's not enough, in my opinion. This is a place that I've changed personally. I used to do a lot of just critical commentary on games, and used to make these reviews that were a little bit rambly, more so, in fact, than this episode of Prototype, if you can believe it, where I would, in a very unstructured manner often, not really talk too much about what I would have done differently about a game, or what I think, could have been improved upon. It's more so just me railing at how bad it is. And I mean, that's only instructive to a certain degree, right? Especially as I've gotten more into the development side, I've realized, there's probably ways in which if I had a past version of myself critiquing my work, I might not find it that useful. And I try to do things in that sense that it is constructive, it is useful, it is, possible to derive a genuine improvement from whatever commentary, critique you're engaging with. That's the kind of thing that I want to be able to provide to developers. And so I'm not really shy about critiquing big, heavy hitter studios like Blizzard, or even like Frost Giant Studios, who clearly have a lot of backing and investment, and think that what was it, $30 million or whatever their budget is not that much to make an RTS game. Well, we're making one with no budget, so I don't know, guys. Like, maybe obviously there's some work still for us to do, but if I had $1 million, you guys would have so much RTS content you don't even fucking know. So that's just my personal life. That's where I'm at, and that's just, it's so mind-boggling to me that it's even possible to waste that many resources. And I say waste because it does, it's too early to tell, obviously, but it really doesn't look like it's my kind of game. It really doesn't look like they're going to do that much different things. I mean, they said something to the effect of how they wanted to do They wanted to tell mature stories and then followed that with in the style of Marvel movies. Like, you can't make this up, man. I mean, if you think that Marvel movies are mature stories, then I kind of got to borrow a quote from Jonathan Blow, who I've interviewed 3 times now over on the No Frauds Club YouTube channel. I think it might have been the second appearance, or maybe it was even the first appearance, but it was something to the effect of, if you think, say Final Fantasy or Mass Effect or whatever is a really good story, maybe you just haven't seen that many stories, right? Maybe you haven't engaged with that many elements of the media, and so your calibration of what you think a good story is just so far from mine that it's hard to reconcile our 2 opinions. And I think that's kind of the point I'm getting at here is Stormgate is clearly not for me. It's for somebody who just wants like the same that we already have, but maybe slightly better in some ways and maybe slightly worse than others, and wholly uninspiring if you're looking for something brand spanking new in the sense that it pushes the envelope and it does something different. I mean, I guess they have creep camps in a StarCraft 2 styled RTS, and that might be considered something different, but no, not really. So anyway, like I was saying, and again, just even in that little encapsulation, I'm talking about Frost Giant Studios. In a past version of myself, I would have just said they're bad, they're shit, like look at all the stuff that they're doing, and I wouldn't have even elaborated. And I certainly wouldn't have given them the credit of, well, this just isn't for me. I was a lot more, you would say, opinionated, but in the sense that maybe it was almost came across as entitlement. And now I look at this and I just think to myself, like, man, if that's the case, if I'm fed up and I'm so not interested in most RTS content, I just need to do it myself, right? And thankfully I don't have to do it myself. I got the community behind me. I got you guys listening on YouTube. I got obviously my right-hand man, Veek7. I got DF, Dark and Fantasies. These are some of the aliases of some of the members that are hanging out, right? We got Balethal and Knight of the Realm pitching in every now and then, and just a whole bunch of people, right? Shout out Fagudo as well. He likes to share this stuff around. So like Luciferius backing us over on the coffee page, which you can also check out, by the way, but I try not to shill too hard. And this is all just stuff that I think is important and good. It's stuff that I think it's really surprising to me that not many people have done anything better, but I mean, that's just the situation we're in. So I'm going to take a sip of water and then we're going to talk a little bit more about all of the details surrounding RTS content and how I feel like it'll be a little bit different with me at the helm. So I feel like it helps to get specific when you're trying to do something along the lines of working your way through, how am I going to do something differently than pretty much everybody else? I want to start off with the classic melee start. Let's bring our minds back to StarCraft 1. If you haven't played it that much, essentially you start out with your town center, which for Terran, for example, is the command center, and you start out with 4 workers, and those are SCVs for Terran. Now, in Cosmonic Brood War, all the names are different, but for the sake of the more layman audience, I'll just keep using some of the vanilla names, assuming I remember to. I mean, a lot of them are ingrained in my brain now. So in Cosmonic Brood War, you actually start out with 6 SCVs instead of 4, and your command center is still the same, right? It has a different add-on that you can build and some other stuff, but it's still just the same structure. And harvesting's a little bit different, but you don't need to worry too much about that. What matters is you just start out with 6 workers instead of 4, and you actually have 100 minerals instead of 50, so you double the starting minerals. This basically allows you to instantly start making some kind of decision about what your first action is going to be. So we sped up the early game ever so slightly, but that's just so that you have a little bit more strategic things to immediately start working on. And this means that it's no longer as dull. Now, I'm more than familiar with the idea that maybe it should be deliberately a little bit slow because, Zoomers need like a TikTok that has, 3 different videos playing all at once while some unrelated narration is going on. That's actually the point of the video. That almost feels like weird fucking government experimental, like torture device shit that's going to incept ideas into your brain about, how you should go about your life in society. I don't know what the fuck that is. That's like weird propaganda shit, but it's, setting that aside, it feels like, when I look at something like the desperate need for things to be faster, you think about StarCraft 2 and Legacy of the Void, they double the worker count. Well, that means that you can expand before 2 minutes. Now you can, end games in 4, 5, 6 minutes. I mean, Uthermal on YouTube has a series that called Speedrunning StarCraft 2. He literally will try to win the game before 6 minutes. And at 6 minutes, he stops harvesting resources. So even if the game technically ends later, like he's all in at that point, there's nothing he can do. So yeah. That's really silly, obviously, and something that I think is like, okay, well, if you want really fast-paced games, then maybe that's for you, but it feels like you no longer have an early game. You just instantly start almost at the mid-game. So we're aware of that as designers over here. We don't want that. What we want is just you to be able to make interesting decisions from the word go, right? And we're even thinking and considering, would it be better if you could basically very, very quickly start being able to build some sort of production facility, right? What would that mean? Like if you started off with 150 minerals instead of 100, well, that means that you could, if you wanted to get super weird and wacky, you might decide to not build an initial worker and instantly drop a barracks as Terran, right? And that could be something that you could work in. That's just a shadow box thought, right? But these are things that we're thinking about. And I know I'm talking about like melee starts. I'm talking about conventional stuff. I'm talking about not really changing anything from the default game about what that you play in multiplayer. And yet I'm also talking about RTS content. And I feel like there's no accident there, right? Like, I think it's good if there's a decent amount of parity between, at the very least, parity between you and your opponents, right? That's the important thing. There has to be fairness. If they have some sort of advantage in terms of pre-placed units, maybe you have to have some sort of advantage in terms of your base is a little bit more resource rich than theirs, or you start off with a slightly bigger bank than they do in terms of starting resources, or maybe you just have a much more defensible position and you can expand easier, or something else. Because the point is that even if the advantages are asymmetric, the strengths and weaknesses asymmetric, at the end of the day, it kind of still washes out, where if you're even in skill, then it's an even matchup. And that's the kind of thing that's so alluring about content, is that you can have so many different ways. It doesn't have to be exactly melee starting conditions. You might start out with a couple of units or even a structure that allows you to train more units, right? But at the very end of things, you are dealing with the opportunity to have an even and fair fight with your opponent. And this is true for even cases where you start off in a free-for-all, or in a case where you have an AI ally and you're a 2v1, or in the inverse case where you're dealing with 1v2. If you start off with enough assets to handle the second player, if you start off with enough of a defender's advantage to not be immediately overrun, this is all really good stuff and gives you the opportunity to really show your skill, even though it's a non-standard situation. That's something you would never find and explore within the melee framework, but we can use the melee framework to start informing our decisions and start to talk about how we would establish that parity. Yeah, maybe you won't have 6 workers and a town center in Cosmonarchy Brood War campaign content. Maybe you'll have something more than that. Maybe you'll have even a little bit extra more than that. Like, I would never necessarily suggest starting you off at tier 2, but you might start off with a decent amount of initial gas in your bank, and you can choose to either hoard that so you can tech up quicker, or maybe spend it a little bit faster so you can get that early game tier 1 advantage. And the same is true for if I want some sort of stronghold enemy AI, and they're defending with this giant vast fortress, and they have so many things at their disposal that they can use in the early game if they want to. Well, guess what? They are going to use them in the early game. And so then we have to think about how we would approach that. Well, then we start thinking about how you would do that in the real world, or in a real world, like the real world we're trying to feel and create in Cosmonarchy Brood War. Well, maybe you would start with a bunch of AI allies sieging this place, and maybe some of those AI allies would be closer to the fortress than you. And so you would have this choice that you could make, where you could either use them as almost fodder so that you could tech up yourself and start to get into a better spot to compete with that fortress stronghold enemy a little bit more one-to-one. And if you don't want to do that, if you want to keep all your allies alive as long as possible because you know that they're going to help you out in the later game, then you can also choose to immediately go for that tier 1 army and start defending your ally, fending off the attacks, trying to, prevent and contain the enemy from expanding outside of the fortress walls. These are all choices that you can choose to make, and maybe you have to make some sort of narrative changes, like maybe the fortress is slightly understaffed, maybe the fortress is a little bit under strength because of previous defeats that happened for that faction before you got to this point. Either way, though, there has to be some reason in universe that is easily felt without necessarily crazy dialogue sort of expositing the information to you. There has to be some reason for the fortress to not immediately fall, but also not immediately win the engagement either. And the problem with the default StarCraft 1 formula is that the enemy should win automatically every single time. There's almost no situation I can think of where you actually have the starting default advantage over the opponent. And I understand that maybe they had a difficult time making the AI actually challenging, or maybe their skill level was so low in the early stages of the game, admittedly before many of the metagame stuff had been figured out, and admittedly still there is top tier metagame stuff happening with, as of the time of recording this, there's actually a bit of a new bunker rush strategy that you can do versus Protoss in the early game of TVP, depending on maps, positions, and what their opening actually is, like if they go Nexus first. So there's still strategies being developed, and there's still things being innovated on, and of course still new maps being made as well, a big factor in changing things up. And I think the fact that maps will change things up even in the Melee game where nothing else changes, it's literally just the map, I mean, that kind of tells you that content can be everything for this. Content can be everything for exploring more nuanced, deep aspects of the game than maybe you get the opportunity to in conventional Melee play. And I think that's just beautiful. Unfortunately, it's not very leveraged, right? You don't really see this too often. You don't see AI allies as a staple, right? In the campaign I'm currently working very heavily on, Day of Blood for Cosmonic Brood War, it'll be 6 missions long, but every single one of those missions is planned for you to have an AI ally, which means, assuming I can wrangle the triggers appropriately, and more on that in the future, this should actually be a co-optional campaign, by which I mean you can choose to play it with an AI-controlled ally, or you can choose to play it in multiplayer, and it will function either way. And I think that would be really neat because I look back to something like Red Alert 3, and longtime viewers of the channel will very often recognize that I don't like Red Alert 3. I think it's actually quite an abysmal title. But I think one of the things that is genuinely good about what it does is that it has this co-op campaign. It has this opportunity for you to dedicated play with 2 players in every single mission. And isn't that just wonderful? Shouldn't there be more content that's way more engaging in a game that's way fucking better than Red Alert 3? That also allows you to play with a buddy if you so desire. I think that's beautiful, and I think that should be not necessarily a standard because you can't always have an AI ally or what have you in every single mission, or maybe the number of AI allies that you have might be different. Like, do I want to necessarily create a campaign where you play as a size of 3, and then you have 3-player co-optional campaign? Like, I mean, I could do something like that, and maybe it would be really cool, but let's start with 2 and see where that goes, because even that is going to constrain map design and a lot of other choices that I have to make for the narrative even, because now I need like a plucky character to go with you and your protagonist, right? And so how does that phase into things, right? What do we do there? So yeah, a bit of a tangent, I guess, on the whole AI thing, but it does feel like there's not that many opportunities for you to have an AI ally or to have an ally at all. And I think that would be a lovely thing to explore. But going back to the starting conditions and talking about all the different things that you can still do, the fact that we're going back to the idea of destroying your enemy base instead of a bunch of gimmicks, that does mean that you have to engage with your opponent's base and you have to engage with their armies. You have to maybe try to harass their economy. If they don't have infinite money, you can start targeting their workers as if you would in a real game, right? A real game, because this is a real game, guys. This is real content. You're really playing a real RTS. And that's something that you really just don't get to see. Your early decisions have weight to them. You're not constrained into just expanding and maybe setting up some static defense. If you choose to do that, then you're choosing not to go on the offensive in the early stages, instead of the game deciding you can't do that because of pre-placed aids. And I think that that's really a good way to describe everything, right? It's like you now have more choice. You now have more opportunity to make things occur. And it's really all about that player choice. So I hopefully have explained the starting condition stuff. And really, we're talking about fairness. We're not talking about number of assets. We're not talking about team balance where it's always 2v2 or 3v3. We're talking about a situation where you might have imbalanced teams. You might have asymmetric starts. You might have free-for-alls where maybe like 2 dudes have teamed up in somewhere, but maybe they're in the middle of the map and caught in the crossfire. Like, that's kind of interesting. What could happen there? You're talking about all these interesting and nuanced and unique things that are unique to the campaign experience, unique to the context and medium of playing a narrative, right? Experiencing this narrative as a commander. That is very different than, say, playing Melee. Even though a narrative of sorts does evolve, especially if you've met that player before and you kind of know what their tendencies are, there is something analogous to how you would construct a story if you had to do that by going back and looking at the events in a game. A conventional match, that is. But there's still the opportunity within that to explore different things, right? You're exploring this pursuit of competitive greatness, this pursuit of victory, and you still want to do that within the campaign, but it's not the only thing that you're doing necessarily. You're also exploring what this narrative is and what this world is, and you're almost given permission to do so by the conceit of the campaign. And we could go on for another discussion about how I'm very interested in the idea of exploring the universe, the world, etc., through the Melee, and that's something that I actually do think is kind of interesting about what I read. I believe this is about Stormgate. It could have been about Immortal, where victories on the esports scene, because of course they're banking on there being an esports scene, the competitive victories will actually change events about the world and lore. I think that's a great way to get the average player involved in the competitive side. If they get hooked on the universe, if they get really interested by some of the concepts, well, guess what? Now they can really invest themselves in that, right? Now they can feel like, okay, well, I really like, Terran. I'm going to play a lot of Terran on the ladder. I'm going to get real good on the ladder. It's kind of unlikely that they do that, but I still think that would be something that would be cool to see. And even if it only converts a couple percentage points of people to playing competitively a little bit more, just because they love the universe that much and they have this, adoration or enjoyment of the setting, I still think that's worth it, man. I still think that's cool. And it's definitely something that I want to see developed and worked on. So hopefully that is an interesting experiment to keep your eyes on. Hopefully Stormgate isn't just a total flop out the gate, although admittedly it probably kind of deserves that fate if it gets it. And when we're thinking about the content side, I think you could explore, another thing that I was thinking of in the pro scene, you think about best of 7s in StarCraft 1, best of 5s, best of 9s even, right? Long series that go on for a couple games. I think about how in the first game, right, you could be meeting on neutral ground. And say it's a best of 5. Well, if the first player wins the first 2 matches, each time they win, their race has more and more of the territory. Or maybe we go a step further. Maybe in a Zerg versus Terran game, you play on neutral ground, and if the Zerg wins, the next map is a little bit more Zergy. Is not necessarily Zerg favored, but the architecture of the map evokes Zerg imagery. It's clearly, the Zerg's pick, essentially, right? The Zerg player gets to pick that. What if we changed the format of the tournaments themselves to make that even more interesting and compelling? And what if we were able to, maybe you could go the counter way. You could say if the Zerg wins, the Terrans fall back to a more Terran fortified stronghold. Now that they get to pick the map because they lost the first one. I don't know, that you could go so many different ways with it, right? You could think so many different ways about trying to, hype up the match. And if they go to the decider, maybe they go back to where it started, the neutral ground, where they started this sortie. Now they're going to finish it. Or they go to something that's equally neutral, but is still about this long-standing war. And there's wreckage all around. And there's ruined corpses and all of this stories of the previous games sort of being created there, right? I think that would be so cool to explore. And I'm not exactly sure how you would do it. It's just sort of this idea that's barely articulated out of my head, but I still think it would be neat to explore. And that would be a way to explore the world. But in the campaigns, you're given this option, this opportunity. You are allowed to explore the setting and not feel like maybe you're reading into it too much or role-playing a little too hard as the commander or whatever else you might be a little bit insecure about, right? I mean, when I play Cosmic Monarchy Brood War, and even when I played StarCraft 1, I would just play ladder matches. I would play matches against players and matches against AI and CMBW as well, since it's a little bit better, I would say, than the default. That's underselling it, of course, but it's certainly a harder fight, a harder opponent. And just by virtue of the races that I would randomize into, or the strategies that I would fight and my opponents would employ, they would give me so many opportunities, so many thoughts of like, oh, wouldn't this be a cool thing to happen in a campaign? Wouldn't this be cool if this thing was happening in the world? And if it feels like it actually could happen because the gameplay is grounded and the game itself actually feels cogent and coherent, why not? Give me that, man. Give me a game like that, because then I can continue to explore the world in my mind's eye, even while I'm whooping ass on ladder. And of course, you'd want to whoop ass in the campaigns too, right? This is about challenging the player. This is about it feeling satisfying to actually claim a win instead of just perfunctory and, oh, I'm glad that's over, which is most of the reactions that I have when playing RTS content, to be honest. So I hopefully have explained about fairness a lot. But within that explanation should be this grounded understanding that you don't have to just have everything be a boring melee experience. You can have many different situations. You can have so many different opportunities for the AI to express different personalities. We talked about how the training tutorial sequence could start you off with a tired, cadet trainer, and he's just so bored, man. He wants to go to bed. He wants this to be over quickly. He's going to rush you down. Well, doesn't that make sense? Isn't that an interesting character thing that you would almost never see in a game or in an RTS at the very least? I feel like that would be way more compelling as opening characterization, even if maybe it is a little bit tropey or pulpy. It would still give you the opportunity to explore that from, doesn't that make sense in the universe? Yeah, this guy's, I'm the 5th guy today that he's training. Of course, he's maybe a little bit fed up, and yet I'm able to, defend if I just put my units in the right spot. And then by holding him at bay, I can get advantages elsewhere, even if I'm a little bit slower because I'm still learning, right? And so it's like this marriage between something that makes sense in universe and something that makes sense for a game, for a tutorial, right? So it's content that delivers on pretty much all sides. And that multifaceted approach where we are able to articulate all of our goals, communicate everything we need to through dialogue, through actions, through the way that, like the story that's being woven as the game is going on, with the push and pull of losing that expansion that you just set up and then striking back and defeating his worker line. And as a result of spewing all of those bodies on the floor, you think, well, you might have a base up on me, but I got workers up on you. And maybe just based on that, you might desperately defend as you set that base up one more time. And if you lose it again, man, it's crushing. And maybe that's actually a loss and you got to retry again. But like, isn't that so much more rich and interesting than, well, the AI is really dumb, but the characters keep telling me in dialogue that he's actually really good at being a commander and he's a worthy opponent and stuff. So I guess he's a worthy opponent, but I can't really see that for myself. Like, that's just lame. And there's a lot of other things I could talk about. I actually wrote a fairly long piece on my website, fraudsclub.com, and I'll link it in the description. It's all about single player experiences, but it's like the non-interactive elements. It's the experiences you have looking at the stories and the narratives and the characters and the plots and it's just how that feels as a player. And spoiler, it's not good. And maybe that would also be this sort of useful critique that I was talking about earlier for the whole idea of approaching designing content within an RTS. Maybe more people should just take a look at that and maybe come up with some ideas for what might be going on there. Anyway, I think we've exhausted the topic of compelling single-player RTS content, at least for now. This is going on 50 minutes. So I'll take another sip of water, and then we'll talk to some of our coffee supporters indirectly through the internet, answering some of your questions. All right. I hope you guys have been liking this, by the way. If you're still here after 50 minutes, hopefully it's been to your liking. I feel, for whatever reason today, everything was flowing. I got all of my topics out, so happy about that. All right, enough back padding, though. Let's get to the coffee questions. Now, coffee, Ko-Fi, because that's a reasonable URL to type, .com/Pronogo and Week7, link in the description. This is where you pledge some money, some threes, in fact, to us either once or every month or whatever, and you get to ask questions according to how many times you've done that, basically. So Myrian, one of our long-time supporters now. It's been a few months since we launched the coffee page, and he signed up fairly quickly. Although I guess, actually, Myrian is, funnily enough, he's not a monthly supporter, but he supports very frequently anyway as like a bunch of one-time things. So at the end of the day, happy to have you either way. And it basically is kind of like he's a monthly supporter. So he's a guy who's very invested in the worlds that we're creating, funnily enough, and always nice to have somebody like that. He asks the kinds of questions where in my head I have all the answers, but then I have to like write it all out, and it just makes the process that much better for world building and whatnot. So of course, happy to have this guy. Now he actually asks a question that's cogent and related to single player scenarios or campaigns or whatever. He's talking about subfactions here. And he asks, will subfactions be featured in your later works, at least in single-player scenarios? So this is off the back of working on a faction system for Cosmonarchy Brood War. Cosmonarchy Brood War has probably like 60, 70, 80 units or something crazy. Well, maybe not that, maybe on the lower end of that estimation. So 50 to 60 units per race, I think, right now. And this is not counting buildings, I think. But anyway, it's a lot. Default StarCraft had like 12 units, by the way. I think maybe Zerg had 11 or something like that. But this is like units that I'm not counting like larvae and eggs and shit. But essentially, yeah, very big increase in overall numbers of units. And you progress through the tech tree fairly slowly. So you would think, on its face, are you really going to make a faction system on top of that? Isn't that a lot of complexity? But I think I've developed an easy way to comprehend the faction system, which is essentially, I just pick things that maybe don't jive with the faction that well, and I replace them with things that do reinforce the faction's identity. So we have this faction that we're currently calling Upstart, because it's just like a catch-all term, and it's basically like a lesser military, right? It could be a pirate military, or some freedom fighters / insurrectionists, or it could be, just like this lesser Terran nation in the cosmos that can't really step to the opponents very well. And so they take the Goliath, which is this tier 1 powerhouse unit that you can build from the word go. Essentially, you just drop a fulcrum, which is our name for the factory, and you start pumping those out. That is essentially your tier 1.5 unit, but it's available early. So you can use this unit, especially combining it with clerics, which can heal units. That's a name for the medic. And, all that stuff. You can essentially build this sort of very powerful pushing force in the early game if you want to invest all the gas for it. And gas being the resource that you predominantly use for teching up, that's very important to decide when you're going to stop spending it, basically. Now, the upstarts don't actually have access to the Goliath. On the one hand, this means that maybe they will spend less gas overall, and they might actually tech up a little bit faster as a result. But the unit that I replaced it with is the Southpaw, and it is a converted vehicle, like a civilian vehicle that's been converted into this crowd control hover bike, basically, or hover car, as it were. And as a result of this, it feels very similar in some ways to the Vulture. It gives you this opportunity for you to work a little bit heavier with harassment tactics, right? And that's kind of familiar to what you would expect out of an upstart military anyway, because maybe they're not going to be able to step to you in the more conventional sense, right? And so that's just one unit replacement. Because we're replacing them instead of adding them, it makes it still somewhat cogent, even in multiplayer where these factions don't exist, to the average layman. Like, okay, well, at least not every unit is different or something. But it also means that you don't have to add more strategies, you just replace some strategies. And this is for facing the factions too. So in the campaign Day of Blood, you play as the upstarts. You don't play against any factions, but still having access to different units than them is going to be quite noticeable. I'm not even sure exactly how to tutorialize that now that I think about it. I might just have some dialogue that when you drop your first fulcrum, maybe what your character, your protagonist remarks, sure would be good to use some Goliaths or something. I don't know. Maybe if you face Goliaths from one of the mechanized regiments in the first mission, that would be something that would definitely happen. And you would say, like, maybe their character would say something to the effect of, like, they're mowing us down with these Goliaths, and they might very quickly but tersely and somehow in an elegant way of the dialogue writing process, I would get to some point where the line would mention somehow, like, wistfully talking about them because they can't use them, and then you can just read between the lines. I don't know. It might not be so obvious, and maybe it's not that important anyway. So this is what the faction system kind of looks like, where we take one unit per production structure or just a couple units here and there, and we say, well, this unit could be replaced because it kind of goes against the ethos of the faction. So this is an opportunity for us to augment other strategies that are a little bit more like that faction. We replace a very powerful defensive tool and detector, the Anseal, from the Starpad, and that's essentially like a tier 1 version of the Starport, if you will, Starport being decidedly tier 2 now. And the Anseal is able to protect units by redirecting projectiles towards it and then absorbing it with its energy. And so the Anseal then is essentially used to keep weaker armies alive longer from especially burst fire, things like Dracodons, our name for the Dragoon, or even something like a Goliath, in fact, that deals a little bit more upfront damage. You can absorb the incoming projectiles and use that to your advantage, but not if you're the upstarts. If you're the upstarts, you have this melee air unit, the Wendigo, and the Wendigo rends armor the more it attacks you. So it essentially gives you this opportunity to deal a decent amount of damage, but it comes at the cost of not having this defensive and detective utility tool. Now, that's not your only source for detection. You can deploy Shamans into visionary mode for that, and they are a vehicle that's actually built by the Stockade, our version of the barracks. But beyond that, you still have this opportunity in this upstart faction environment to, now, if you go Starpad, it means something completely different. But it means that you can be really aggressive. You train Wraiths, Trojans, which are our name for dropships, and now Wendigos instead of Anseals. And so you can do this like sort of infantry drop strat into, picking people off with permanently cloaked Wraiths or attacking people with the Wendigos to rend the armor. Now suddenly Mavericks become more powerful when paired with Wendigos, because Mavericks, our word for the Marine, they don't actually have the opportunity to rend armor themselves. They need some sort of armor rending, like a Hurakan, our name for the Firebat, or indeed the Wendigo now with the upstart faction. They need that to rend the armor so they can be more effective against things like buildings, or even, again, things like Goliaths. So you get this opportunity where there's this sort of tapestry, if you will, of how all of the units interact with each other, even from the word go, even at tier 1, where you're spending maybe 10 minutes before you tech up in the average game, ideally. And as a result of that, you get this opportunity to just more interestingly express what your faction's playstyle is. And so hopefully I've made a good case and compelling case for why factions even exist at all. The reason why I needed to do this is to say, I'm actually not sure if the factions will be in our later works. They do add a decent amount of art pipeline sort of overhead. you do need to obviously make new units, and that means that you need to build new, I guess you would say portraits or something for them, ideally, obviously the models for the unit themselves, and then you would also want to be able to look at them and say, okay, well, they have custom voice acting, so I got to write the unit responses. And then on top of that, you have to make sure that they're vetted well in the game. So it's not just the audio visual stuff of setting them up and making them, feel like a proper unit. It's also feel like a unit within this race, within this faction. Like, make sure that this unit still serves a good purpose and works properly as a concept. The faction system also allows us to say, have this unit that maybe competes really heavily with another unit, but if we replace that unit that it's competing with, now we have an opportunity for a different spin on things, right? It gives you this different experience that is almost like riffing on the tech tree. And that's really the attractive part to me, because I have so many ideas for units, guys. I mean, there's a reason why my magnum opus that I'm working on, right? Our magnum opus, really, because we're all interested in the Xibalba universe and we're all interested in Cosmonarchy Retail. The title of the game, well, it's just going to be called Cosmonarchy, but to not confuse it with the Brood War mod. I might have to actually rebrand the full game at some point, but we'll get to that eventually. Cosmonarchy Retail is meant to have 20 factions, right? 20 races, rather. We're calling them regencies because some of them have more than one race associated with them, and some of them aren't even biological at all. So you think about that and you think, oh man, 20 regencies, that's a lot. Well, surely the tech trees are going to be smaller than CMBW. No, they're going to be larger. You're going to have 10 tiers of tech, guys. That's what we want. So, I mean, this is crazy stuff. This is very ambitious stuff. Just having one race, one regency of that size would be ambitious for the average RTS that generally tends to have 10 to 12 units, right? So that's just a little bit of a taste. And so if we really felt like adding more stuff to that by instantiating factions, it just feels like maybe that would be too much for something like Cosmonarchy Retail. Maybe it wouldn't be necessary. Maybe we would decide that we would find some spots for it, though. You never know. As far as games in between now and Cosmonarchy Retail, I also don't fully know, but I think it would probably be more likely that we just build out the game and we have all of the factions be exactly the same, all the races be exactly the same between campaign and melee, at least for our first title. And we'll revisit it for something like maybe like Onatar or whatever, which is actually meant to be a little bit more customizable anyway. And so maybe that defeats the purpose of factions. So actually, the answer to this question is with the 3 RTS games that we currently plan, because 3, of course, we might not ever see factions revealed as an official mechanic, but time will tell. And hopefully that explained the reasoning behind why I'm currently not so sure that we would. The first one, our first game, codenamed Pangea, not sure that we have the current sort of roster of people ready to do all of the audio-visual work on it. And we still need to make the fully fledged original game and then riff on the tech trees after if we want to. So we're not there yet and we can't really know. And obviously it would add a lot of overhead. The second game, it's about customizing your tech tree. That's Onatar. That's the Pretense of War. You've got this pretense system that lets you customize your military in certain ways to make it totally unique to you, even just entirely by riffing on the faction, giving you different traits. So we probably don't need a faction system on top of that. Maybe we would think of the pretenses as being factional, as in one set of pretenses. Say you have like a bunch of different traits, like being, giving lifesteal or giving regeneration or giving speed. Maybe those would be assigned to different races within the world, right? That's very likely, especially considering we think about like lifesteal. That seems obviously like a blood summon trait. So that would be one example. And then obviously in Cosmonarchy Retail, it's kind of a tall ask for us to do that, considering we already plan on having like 100 units or something crazy per regency and having so many regencies. Instead of factions, you just pick a different regency. It's pretty crazy. Well, my voice is definitely starting to go now, so let's get to Keyan's question. Keyan, the homie, he's been around for maybe longer than anybody at this point, with the possible exception of Mesk, in terms of just being my guy, right? My guy. We actually used to work on custom content way back when for StarCraft 1. We had all these ideas for, basically fan fiction projects, right? But like we were thinking like, oh man, wouldn't it be so cool if we could get people attached to all these characters and then kill them off in entertaining ways? Yeah, we were doing Game of Thrones before it was Game of Thrones, guys. We were on some different shit. Anyway, we never ended up finishing any of that. So let's talk about Keyan's question. He's also a big money guy, spend a lot of money, not actually on the monthly shtick in terms of like the repeated support, but he's the homie. He was the homie even before he gave us any money, but here he is. He's earned plenty of questions here. So he says, curious if your Zerg campaign for Cosmonarchy Brood War, when it happens, will feature the Overmind, or if you'll be trying to take an original spin on the Zerg with the player just being a tendril, with the general objective of consuming everything. So it's really interesting because I was talking with Balethal recently. He's another guy who's on and off sort of been helping us out quite a bit, especially with regards to like terrain rendering and doing some Blender stuff. And he kind of got me jump started on modeling and all that. And he said that he was thinking of how would you represent the Zerg consciousness? Because in Cosmonic Brood War, we have a very different setting. We try to completely diverge ourselves off from the least interesting parts of StarCraft 1's original lore. We're in a different cosmos, a different sector. Like, we have a very different location. We have different politics, different factions, and we don't have all of these interpersonal relationships that we got to worry about. There's no Kerrigan, there's no Raynor, there's no Overmind, there's no anything from the original saga. And instead, we think of like, sort of like how I was talking about factions riffing on the tech trees of races. We kind of have riffs of the races too. We're basically in a situation where the races themselves, they're like the best that I thought they could be, right? I'm taking the promising parts and kind of focusing in on that, and the interesting parts and exploring them in a different way. If you guys have seen Max Landis's work, he's this very quirky, I guess, auteur. I don't know how to describe him without maybe sounding like, you know, I'm degrading his person. He's just an interesting character, I'll say that much. And he actually has a bunch of stuff that is very divergent from established fiction for things like, you know, Superman, for example, a bunch of comic book stuff, but he takes it into his own way. And some of the things I find interesting, some of the things I don't, but at the very least, you can tell he's passionate about it. So anyway, that's kind of like what we've done for Cosmonic Brood War, or for StarCraft with Cosmonic Brood War. If you've seen or heard of his Kryptonian Epic series, then that's somewhat comparable, I think. We have very different goals, like than the original StarCraft, right? We're trying to tell stories that are sensible and just work properly, with the idea of the scale making sense within the story. There's not going to be an opportunity for you to extinguish the race. You don't have Tassadar saying that, you know, the fate of the universe hangs in the balance or whatever at the end of the Protoss campaign in the original StarCraft. Like, that's stupid. It doesn't hang in the balance. There will be Terran, Zerg, and Protoss after this in other places. But what matters is these characters are in jeopardy right now. What do you do? So anyway, that's the important sort of raison d'etre for a lot of the cases here. And when you're thinking about the context of the Overmind or Zerg in general, you know, how do you represent the Zerg consciousness? How do you represent tendrils, which is our concept for, like, basically it's like, what if broods were bigger, right? So instead of just a brood being like, I don't know, the size of a planet, you've got what we're calling tendrils, which are just teeming with stuff. Like, there are trillions of Zerg or quadrillions of Zerg in these things. And so they send out these smaller groups of Zerg called organs. And the organs are basically like, they have specific purposes. So when they show up on a planet to explore, they might call that a seeding organ. They're laying the groundwork for a future invasion. They're seeing if there's even something here that they want. And they're very enigmatic, but they also seem to just consume everything in some cases, like Keyan says. It's not necessarily established what their purpose is or what they want to do, but they certainly do descend upon things where it makes sense. And for, you know, like, that's just sort of the situation there is. So they've got loads of stuff. Like, it's not really possible to destroy a tendril. There are times where tendrils will fight conflict against each other. And that's pretty much that's the main opportunity for you to see, like, maybe one of the tendrils could actually get destroyed. Like the tendril we see in one of the campaigns that's forthcoming just actually finished a victorious war, but it was very costly, with another tendril and a very large Terran nation that's been reduced to a lesser nation within the cosmos now because of that fight. And this very, very bloody war resulted in both of the tendrils that were involved going down to just a few trillion agents. And when I say just a few trillion, I'm not being facetious. Like, that is actually kind of low if it's only a few. So that's a case where, like, maybe they could get swallowed up by something else or whatever. So you know a little bit about tendrils, you know a little bit about the scale that we're trying to achieve. Obviously, we can never have trillions of units in any game, like speed of light and all this other stuff. But it's just one of those things that would be great if we could at the very least talk about these bigger scale things, right? And again, it doesn't matter if there's always going to be Zerg or Terran or Protoss. What matters is that the characters that you're talking to and engaging with and becoming attached to or interested by, those characters are in jeopardy. They have their own agendas. They're going to try to execute those agendas competently and save their skins and all this other stuff. That's important. So we can make it important if we're competent about presenting our ideas. It's a lot harder to do that when you don't have characters because you're a hive mind. So how would you go about doing that? So I was sort of spitballing this problem with Balethal. He said that he had described or discussed the idea in his own head about what if you have a chorus of voices, and that's how you could represent a character. The tendril itself could be this chorus of disassociated voices. I believe that's something that he said anyway. I know he talked about the chorus of disassociated voices and how that was supposed to be like a representation of the consciousness. And so I immediately started to think about like a lot of what happens with my ideation process is I'll find an idea. It might be mine. It might be somebody else's. Somebody might just give me this little seed that I can carry for. I grab that shit and I run with it. Like my brain just immediately sort of extrapolates it out. And whenever I talk about my brain doing stuff like that, by the way, this is a very strange tangent. I'm curious if anybody else has stuff like this where they get this like mental image that is very evocative of like the actual sensation or whatever, or process of doing stuff. But I always imagine like a tree immediately like jumping out of the ground in terms of how fast it's growing, but like it's a bunch of neurons or something, you know what I mean? Like it's this weird fucking, I don't know. There's something interesting about that visual. Anyway, that's what gets into my head, and that's how I would describe my process. Sometimes I can give myself the ideas. Sometimes, that happens, but a lot of it is just this breakthrough moment, right? And that shit's like, that's my version of the light bulb going off above my head, right? So anyway, Balethal gives me this idea, and I start to think about like, well, okay, what if we actually have a lot of those choruses though? Like what if those choruses are the manifestation and translation for the player's sake of the information gathering process of the tendril? We've got agents on the ground in many different locations. We've got, so many different organs that have landed. What are those organs? What is the consensus there? What is the information? Let's process that. And we do still have to walk a fine line. We don't necessarily want the organs to have personality, but I don't think it's actually that difficult to imagine. Like something that you actually see a lot of problems with in the idea of a hive mind or a unified consciousness is you think that means that there's no disagreement. Like if the Zerg are a hive mind, then why do the tendrils fight each other? Well, maybe the tendrils are warring for some other reason. Like maybe the tendrils are individual hive minds. And that's sort of like what I've gone with is the idea that like the overmind could have been considered a tendril. The brain behind the tendril or whatever, right? The central nervous system of the tendril, of a tendril, of the Pr0totype tendril, right? And so that's sort of how you can like reintegrate the idea of the default Zerg into our new setting that I've essentially co-written with the community and had all these ideas for like what I thought was interesting. And one of the things I think is interesting about Zerg is if you present them as this force of nature, and they can't necessarily be reasoned with, but in order to still be interesting, they need to have the opportunity to have infighting, and so that's where the tendril versus tendril stuff happens, where they're warring for resources or whatever they're actually warring about. And then also you think about, well, could there be momentary confusion? Right. Well, I mean, think about the human body. It attacks itself all the time, right? We think about like cytokine storms, I think they're called, and other things for your autoimmune diseases and whatnot. And it's like that shit can really fucking mess somebody up. That stuff can be really deadly. And of course, that means that like you might have a disagreement. I mean, when you consider the idea of a cancer or some sort of autoimmune issue, having a disagreement between organs or a disagreement between agents is a lot more sensible, right? It's like, okay, maybe I wouldn't go outright and say they have some sort of weird autoimmune issue or some allegory to that. And that's why two of the same tendrils organs have started to fight each other. Like, okay, maybe that doesn't happen, but they could at the very least, come to different conclusions. Or one of them could say, this organ requires more of this resource or of this assistance or this thing to happen for it to get what it wants or needs or whatever. You could say that and then still have a competing thing from another organ. So if we imagine that the organs are sort of like the characters, then suddenly we can still adapt this into a format that makes sense for an RTS, because each organ can be almost like a Cerebrit was in the context of StarCraft 1. But instead of worrying too much about making sure that they make stupid decisions like oppose Kerrigan or whatever the fuck that was all about when Kerrigan became infested and humanized the Zerg and stopped them from being interesting. Like, okay, that all happens. But if we imagine something like that, like, okay, that's better. That's significantly better than being able to just be put into a position where we have no character. We have no opportunity. It's all going to be like just whatever happens there. And so, yeah, you're not just a tendril there to destroy everything. I think you will be you will see you'll follow a specific organ, you will be a specific organ, but you will have this chorus of other voices that are the organs that come with you. And maybe there will be even like cross-tendril communication, right? Maybe there would be an organ from another environment, right? And so I'm really hyped about the thought process that I've gotten to based on this question and based on talking with Balefell about it too. Because, I mean, a lot of these ideas that I just rattled off here, I hadn't articulated or written down anywhere. And it's only through these kinds of questions that I can get to the point where I'm getting to what I think are interesting results. At least potentially interesting results. So thanks for your question, dude. And hopefully you found the answer interesting. In fact, I'm a lot more interested in exploring a Zerg-centered campaign now that I've come up with the answer to this question and sort of culminated. It's not the end yet, obviously. There's still more ideation to be had, but reached the next milestone, we'll say, in the ideation process and the concept of what Zerg actually are and how we could represent them. So if organs are characters in the sense that they are, they have their own sort of goals and they're still in service to the tendril, but they have their own sort of predilections. They have their own specialties, what they're good at, similar to actual organs in the human body. And maybe they reach disagreements or competing interests where only one of their requests can be satisfied, right? Only one of the organs can get what they want out of a certain thing. Like there's finite resources on the map, for example, and one of them needs to expand there. That would be a very obvious, simple thing. Then of course there can be disagreements. Of course there can be friction. And of course there can be this interesting dynamic, but it doesn't have to feel like, two lovers being really angry with each other over a fight. It doesn't have to feel like two characters squabbling, which would be much more of a human thing and certainly not befitting this hive mind consciousness, essentially this analogy to a living, breathing organism at a colossal, unimaginable scale. So I think that will conclude this episode of Prototype. And if you think that 12, by the way, was the best one, well, I think so too, but wait until 13 because it might also be good. So subscribe and I'll see you guys there.